The first true rain of autumn had come, soft and undemanding, the sort that lingers on coat sleeves and college stone like something mournful and half-forgotten. I remember watching it trail down the pane beside me, each drop performing a small private descent. The cappuccino had long since cooled. Still I cupped it, more for company than comfort, while the crossword stared back with quiet disdain. Where knowledge burns, silence falls. 9 letters. I had tried conscience and crossed it out. Palimpsest was better suited to another clue entirely, and revelation felt too loud for the hush I sensed beneath the phrasing. The setter, I suspected, knew too well the difference between truth spoken and truth endured. Across the room, students stirred like pages turned too quickly. One leaned in close to her companion and murmured something through a veil of cinnamon steam. I didn't catch the words, but the tone, that slow exhalation of astonishment tinged with relief, made the back of my mind take notice. There had been a death, I gathered. Someone of importance, or at least someone with a name worth remembering for a few terms. The waiter hovered, hopeful for a signal. I drained what remained of the cup, left the exact change tucked under the chipped porcelain, and stepped out into the mist that had thickened while I brooded. Oxford wears rain the way some women wear perfume. Not ostentatiously, but with an intimacy that lingers. The cobbles beneath the Radcliffe shone with an almost ecclesiastical sheen, and for a moment I felt, absurdly, that I ought to remove my hat out of respect. There was no funeral. Not yet. Only that strange whisper of absence which settles over old buildings before the bells have found the right tone of mourning. I passed St. Mary's, then down the narrowing press of Brasenose Lane, the scent of wet stone following like a thought I hadn't finished. It was hours later, long after I'd returned home and poured the first and only whiskey of the evening, that the call came. Strange, characteristically unbothered by the hour. Delivered it with an unnecessary cheeriness that sounded rehearsed. Retired professor. Classics man. St. Jude's. Dead in his rooms. Nothing suspicious, just the usual courtesy to let me know. Wouldn't have bothered, he said, except the porters thought it odd. 1 cup on the tray. Only 1. It was that, of course. Not the death, not the age of the deceased, not even the quiet mention of St. Jude's. That caught in the gears. Only 1 cup, and yet something had been expected. Or someone. I set the receiver back in its cradle, and for a moment the house resumed its former silence. But I found myself reaching for the crossword again. Where knowledge burns, silence falls. 9 letters. I tried liberation, then retraction, then simply stared. The word wasn't ready to be found. And somewhere behind the rain, behind the fogged glass and the hush of Radcliffe Square, I knew the same would be true of the truth. It never begins with the body. It begins, almost always, with what's missing, or with what no one remembers to say. It was the sort of room one entered with a hush already forming in the throat. Not from reverence, precisely, but from the strange stillness that settles when a life has just slipped quietly from its moorings. Mallinson's quarters at St. Jude's held the smell of tobacco and varnished oak, a faint after-echo of burnt milk, and something else I couldn't name. Not quite absence, not yet presence. The sort of smell that lingers when a door's been closed too long. Lewis stepped ahead, as he often did when uncertain of what to do with his hands, and took in the scene with that unpretentious practicality that always made me feel rather tired. There's a calmness to Lewis's mind that resists metaphor. He sees 1 teacup and names it as 1 teacup. I, on the other hand, saw a pair of faint depressions on the opposite armchair cushion and began, as ever, to wonder. The cup, delicate porcelain, hairline crack near the rim, sat just to the right of a paperback copy of the Baquet, spine fractured along line 72. The coffee had sloshed over slightly, creating a darkened stain that had begun to blur the edge of a discarded envelope. I leaned in. No return address. Handwritten. The ink had bled just enough to make Jude's college bursar a guess rather than a certainty. But even smudged, certain phrases rise like ghosts. Misplacement of funds, informal inquiry, unfortunate oversight. Language, like death, has its own euphemisms. The doctor, summoned already, had concluded heart failure, a respectable end for a classics man. I've always thought there was something oddly classical about dying alone in one's study, like Caesar stabbed not in the Senate, but in a wingback chair, listening to Bach and refusing sugar. The radio was still murmuring. A Brandenburg concerto, if I wasn't mistaken. The volume dial slightly too far to the left, as though someone unfamiliar with the device had adjusted it. I noted it, but said nothing. Mallinson's books lined the walls like judges. Greek texts, marginalia in his neat, fastidious hand. A lifetime of thoughts too nuanced for lecture halls. Above the fireplace, a portrait of the Radcliffe Observatory caught in winter dusk. I remembered it hanging there years ago, though I'd only been in this room once. Briefly, and for reasons unrelated to Mallinson himself. Funny how places retain your former self like a scent. The porter had been deferential, but too quick to describe the professor as beloved. That sort of adjective, I've found, often emerges when the truth is either unknown or inconvenient. I asked if anyone had visited him the previous night. The porter hesitated. There may have been footsteps, he said just after Hall, but no knock had followed. He'd assumed the professor had gone to bed, alone. Lewis wandered past the bureau, eyeing the half-finished crossword. He tilted his head. A clever one, he said absently. 8 across. Unremembered, but never lost. 6 letters. He offered me a smile. You'd have liked him, sir. I didn't return the smile. My gaze had caught on the edge of a photograph, tucked behind a stack of old term reports. The frame was narrow, brass dulled by age, the glass speckled with something like dust, but not quite. A woman, late 20s perhaps, looking just past the camera, unsmiling. Not posed, but paused. Her face held that rare combination of clarity and secrecy that makes even memory hesitate. The photo had not been proudly displayed. It had been hidden, almost ceremonially so. Lewis asked if I thought the memorial was too soon. I said nothing. Time is a curious thing in Oxford. Elastic, symbolic, and often irrelevant, but haste in grief is always suspect. It was only as we turned to leave, coat collars already rising against the coming rain, that Lewis asked it. Why only 1 cup if he was expecting someone? A question dropped like a stone into still water. I looked back once more, the chair with its mirrored indentations, the tray so carefully centered, the silence so thoroughly prepared. I thought, not for the first time, that the dead rarely forget their appointments, but it is the living who often leave early, or never arrive at all. The autopsy, when it arrived, said precisely nothing, though it said it very neatly. No toxins, no trauma, no foreign substance in the bloodstream unless you count a half-digested ham sandwich as criminal. The heart had given out, they said, as hearts are expected to do eventually. Lewis took the report at face value. I've always distrusted conclusions that arrive on time. I returned to St. Jude's the following morning. The porter offered his nod, a shade cooler than the one before, as though the building itself had begun to resent my presence. Oxford does not care for investigations. It prefers things buried, preferably under Latin. The college registry is a grim little warren tucked behind the dining hall, lined with bound minutes and the heavy odor of toner. A young woman in a grey cardigan shuffled through the visitor log, with fingers that moved more like correction than curiosity. She pointed to a name, Sebastian Vane, signed in 2 weeks prior. The same Vane who had once been Mallinson's brightest, or most dangerous, pupil. A poet now, the sort that scribbles in the margins of literary magazines and makes enemies in reviews. I hadn't seen Vane in years, though his words, elliptical, savage, had drifted across my desk more than once. There was one poem I remembered. It had begun, "You taught me verbs, but not restraint." A brutal thing, razor-sharp in its enjambments. Mallinson had taught him the classics. He had made of them a weapon. I found Vane in a pub off St. Aldate's, tapping ashes into a saucer. He looked older, but in that hollow-eyed, well-cut way that made you think he could vanish mid-sentence. When I mentioned Mallinson, his gaze flickered, but the voice remained dry. "No," he said, "he hadn't seen Arthur in years. He thought he was already dead." He used the phrase not out of cruelty, but boredom. I mentioned the registry. A blink, nothing more. Said it must have been someone else. I didn't press. Some lies are so poor they don't require rebuttal. But he did ask, before I left, whether Arthur had still kept the photograph. He didn't say which one. He didn't need to. Back at the college, I stepped again into Mallinson's rooms. The books had been touched, lightly, respectfully, as if by someone dusting the contours of the past without quite entering it. I opened the coffee tin. Nearly empty. Mallinson had never taken it black. He preferred 2 sugars, always stirred with the same bent-handled spoon. Yet the sugar jar was untouched. An omission, perhaps, or a message. There are moments when the absence of a habit speaks louder than its presence. I pocketed the spoon. It was cold and somehow too clean. I sat for a while, letting the room return to itself. The letter from the bursar had been left on the bureau, reopened but not refolded. I read it again. Most of it was unremarkable. Departmental numbers, projected endowments, a nod to the annual lecture series. But in the second paragraph, something caught, a phrase I'd overlooked before, nestled amid polite legalese, regrettable misplacement of the Corin bequest. I read it twice. The words had the texture of apology without its weight. Corin. I knew the name, though not from where. It stirred faintly, like the half-remembered line of a play one doesn't know they've seen. Something in it rang dissonant. Not the crime, if there was one, but the note it struck. Lewis, when I returned to the station, was polishing off a packet of crisps with the kind of focus he rarely afforded reports. He asked, without looking up, whether I thought the coffee meant anything. I said nothing. Some men die with secrets still lodged under their tongues. Others die for fear they'll be forced to speak. Mallinson's death was beginning to taste of the second. The coffee had been bitter, the sugar untouched, the silence carefully arranged, and somewhere behind it all, a name I could not yet place, Corin, lay like a chord unresolved. I had not intended to go into Waterstones. There are afternoons that drift rather than progress, and that day had taken on the feel of wet tracing paper, translucent, reluctant, oddly slippery. I walked in more for the smell than the books. That faint cologne of ink and binding glue and fresh possibility, though lately even the poetry section had begun to smell of marketing. I was thumbing a new edition of Donne when a slim volume caught the corner of my vision. Not the spine, but the placement. Someone had tucked it beside the philosophy shelf, either by mistake or subtle intention. Ashes and Thorns by Sebastian Vane. The cover bore no image, just a staggered title in grey on grey, and something about that struck me as terribly deliberate. I opened it at random. The language was muscular, spare, and flecked with disdain, as though Vane had long since discarded metaphor as an affectation. Near the back, the dedication, "To A who taught me truth's cost." No date, just that sentence, poised like a hinge between intimacy and indictment. A shop girl was restocking nearby, the sort that says painterly to describe syntax and wounded for anything in italics. I asked casually whether the author had been in. She thought a moment, said he'd been in last Thursday, had asked after a book on Orphic rituals. Out of print, she thought, or miscatalogued. Said something about it being Mallinson's. That was when the air shifted. Not the facts, but the alignment. Vane hadn't just admired Mallinson. He had trailed him through the underworld. Outside, the sky had drained of conviction, and people passed in low murmurs, as though carrying secrets in their coat linings. I crossed Broad Street toward the Sheldonian, intending nothing more than to walk off a thought, when I saw her. She wasn't young, but youth had clearly once been hers without effort. That kind of English elegance that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with restraint. Her hair was pinned in a style I hadn't seen since the Thatcher years, and her shoes were too well made to be new. She stood not facing the building, but as if waiting for it to speak. I followed her, not with purpose, but with that curiosity that precedes knowledge. She moved slowly, without hesitance, through the northern gate of the Bodleian, and I kept far enough behind to avoid notice. She signed in under a name I could not read, but I caught the code on the request slip. Mallinson Collection. She wasn't here for casual memory. She was here to exhume something. The librarian called her Doctor. Wytham, she answered softly, without the performative emphasis most doctors favor. I watched from the stacks. Not hidden, but outside her attention, as she leafed through an annotated text of Euripides. Her fingers hovered as though tracing something not printed but remembered. When she finally turned, she looked not startled but unsurprised, as though I'd always been there, standing just out of frame. She said simply that she hadn't expected Arthur to die without saying it. Her voice was low, round-voweled, touched by a cadence that did not belong to Oxford. Cambridge, I thought, or somewhere older still. I asked nothing. She offered nothing. The silence between us was not awkward. It was familiar. Later, over a bitter coffee in a place too modern for either of us, I learned her name was indeed Clara Witham, once a fellow at Trinity Hall. Briefly brilliant then, vanished. I'd heard her name in the footnotes of vanished debates. She had spoken once at a conference I hadn't attended. She had written, long ago, about Orphic descent, the idea that truth is bought only through symbolic death. I remembered the phrase, "All knowledge costs its witness." She asked no questions about the case, only said again that Arthur had promised he would say it, but he hadn't. He died with the silence still between them. I didn't ask what it was. I suspected she wouldn't have answered, and even if she had, the truth would not have arrived cleanly. It would have come broken, refracted, as it always does in Oxford, through glass, through time, through men who never quite learned how to say what they meant. But I noticed something she hadn't meant to show. When she closed the book of Mallinson's notes, her thumb lingered not on the marginalia, but on the dedication inside the cover. It had been crossed out, carefully, in ink. The name had once been hers. It was the scout who told me, in the sort of hesitant cadence that only surfaces when one believes, rightly or wrongly, that the truth might be inconvenient. She was older than most, with a flattened accent that had softened into a kind of pan-collegiate neutrality. When she said Mallinson's door had been left unlocked, it wasn't accusation I heard in her voice, but bewilderment. He'd never done that before, she said. Not once in all the years she'd brought him tea and vanished his dust. And then, quite naturally, as though the thought had wandered in unbidden, she added that she'd seen 2 cups on the tray when she laid it out. That afternoon, not one. I didn't correct her. I simply let the silence hang between us long enough that she began to revise her memory. her mouth starting and stopping, then settling into apology. Lewis, of course, dismissed it as the usual muddle. Perhaps she'd meant another day, or perhaps she'd seen a cup twice. The mind repeats itself sometimes, he said, like an old song. But I remembered Mallinson's rooms. I remembered the perfect geometry of the tray. 1 cup, 1 spoon, 1 saucer. And I remembered the faint, opposing indentations in the cushion beside him, like the ghost of a presence that had not stayed long enough to be remarked upon. It was high table that evening, and I accepted the invitation more out of instinct than appetite. There are things one learns at dinners that are never said during interrogations. Scholars, when plied with enough claret and context, reveal themselves not through what they confess, but through what they consider beneath confession. The fellows of St. Jude's were gathered in the panelled hall with the kind of stilted warmth that accumulates around traditions too old to be abandoned. The air was thick with murmured deference, each comment lacquered in irony, just thick enough to avoid real meaning. Across from me sat Professor Gavin Leach, a man of lean features and glib mind. He spoke of Mallinson in the way people sometimes speak of the dead, generously, carelessly. Said he'd always had a fondness for the Orphic myths. Obsession, really. Thought he could navigate the underworld better than most. Pity he never found his way back. A few around him chuckled, then glanced quickly toward me. I offered no smile. The joke was tasteless, of course, but what stayed with me wasn't the words. It was the flinch. The bursar, seated 2 places to my left, had glanced down so swiftly it looked rehearsed. He reached for his wine, then changed his mind. After dinner, I stepped briefly into the college library, needing the comfort of ink and order. The lamps cast soft pools of gold against the worn leather spines, and I stood for a long while near the reference desk, thinking not of what had been said, but of what had not. Where knowledge burns, silence falls. The crossword clue again. It had come back to me with an edge I hadn't felt before. A fire, not of destruction, but of erasure. I looked around the library, the catalogues, the curated shelves, and thought of how easily a name could vanish. A book could be misfiled. A collection redacted. I remembered the bursar's letter. Regrettable misplacement. Outside, the rain had started again. Fine, needling, persistent. I walked alone across the quad, the stones shining like bone beneath the lamplight. In the corner window, Mallinson's study was dark now, though the room felt somehow less empty than before. Perhaps it was only memory. Perhaps it was something else. 1 cup, then 2, then 1 again. I've always believed that the dead leave traces. Not declarations, not signs. Just small shifts in arrangement, quiet misalignments that catch the eye if you happen to be looking with enough regret. Tonight, I was. It was raining again when Vane returned, though the rain by then had softened into something almost apologetic, the kind that hangs in the air rather than falls. He arrived without an appointment, his collar up, a thin book of poems tucked inside his coat like contraband. Lewis was less than pleased. He had taken a mild dislike to Vane early on. Partly on account of the man's evasiveness, but mostly, I think, because Vane refused to be embarrassed by his own cleverness. I watched him carefully. Not for guilt, necessarily, but for memory. People wear memory differently when they lie. Vane leaned back in the chair as if being questioned were a familiar choreography. He admitted it without prompting. He had seen Mallinson the week before his death. Briefly, coldly. The sort of visit that begins as reconciliation and ends as rehearsal for distance. He said Arthur had accused him of betrayal, not of theft, not of violence, of betraying memory. Lewis scribbled that down and looked at me. Later he would say the phrasing meant nothing, a poet's conceit, but I knew Mallinson's choice of words would have been deliberate and devastating. Vane glanced down at the unyielding desk, fingers drumming lightly on the spine of the book he hadn't yet surrendered. Said Mallinson once told him, "We drink our wisdom in pairs, but die alone." He smiled when he said it, but the smile didn't linger. I asked if the quote appeared in any of his poems. He said it didn't. Arthur had never liked to be footnoted. I let him leave without further prodding. Sometimes clarity arrives more quickly when the subject is gone. Later, I found Clara with him in the chapel garden. Not praying, precisely, but facing something. The rain had left the benches glistening, and she stood beneath a tree that hadn't yet admitted to the season. Her coat was dark, elegant, practical, the kind of garment one keeps for years until it becomes more habit than fabric. She didn't turn when I joined her, simply said that Mallinson had never quite forgiven her, and then, as if it were just another sentence, as if I already knew, she said they had been engaged. Briefly, in the way academics sometimes are, more out of shared reference than passion. I asked about the scandal, the missing thesis, the accusations. She exhaled very softly. Said the paper had vanished just before submission. Said Arthur had helped her rewrite it, and then, later, had implied it wasn't hers. There were no formal charges, just a silence that grew thick enough to be mistaken for truth. She insisted it wasn't relevant, that she hadn't seen him in years, that the past, however bruised, no longer bled. But I'd learned, long ago, that Oxford does not forget. It simply reshuffles its shame until the edges are less sharp. Before I left, I asked what the thesis had been about. She paused. The ethics of memory, in translation. Then she smiled, not at me, but at the idea, and said she still believed the footnotes had been more honest than the text. As I walked away, her phrase followed me like a faint echo. We drink our wisdom in pairs, and I remembered the cup, the second indentation, the sugar untouched. Memory, in Oxford, is never archival. It is performative, and betrayal, when it comes, is often written not in violence, but in ink. Back at the station, Lewis frowned at the statement, said he couldn't make sense of it. Betraying memory? What does that even mean? I told him it meant more than he thought, and perhaps less than we hoped. He asked if I believed her. I said nothing. It was too early for certainty. But not, I thought, too late for metaphor. It was the archivist who found it. Not because I asked, but because he had been looking for something else. A name misfiled under Hall instead of Mallinson, an error so trivial it might have gone unnoticed another 50 years. But mistakes, I've found, are often more loyal to the truth than memory. The photograph was black and white, taken in the late spring of 1971. The paper curling slightly at the edges, the faces grain soft and washed with a kind of formal light that no longer exists. It showed 3 figures at the front, Arthur Mallinson in his prime, his gaze distant even then, Clara Witham beside him, mouth almost smiling, her hand barely touching the cuff of his coat, and a third man, Vane's father, lean, deliberate, with that compressed elegance old dons carry like ruin. But it was the 4th figure I noticed, barely visible, near the chapel's archway, her posture caught in that unsettled moment just before movement. She was turned half away, as though unsure whether to join the gathering or step back into the shade. Her hair, pale and unpinned, gave her a ghostly indistinction, and yet I knew her at once. Annalise Corinne. The name had hovered at the edge of things for days. The bequest in the bursar's letter, the feeling of something lost but not misplaced. Seeing her in the photograph gave the name gravity. Mallinson had kept a portrait of her, framed and quiet, almost deliberately obscured in the far corner of his rooms. I asked the archivist what became of her. His reply was cautious. Not uncertain, but filtered. She died in 1974. A fall from the chapel tower. He used the word accident first, then corrected himself to incident. He mentioned the word suicide only after looking away. But language betrays us. The way he said it, the pause, the choice, told me it was not grief that had silenced the story, but discomfort. As though her death had been too complicated to memorialize and too inconvenient to forget. Later, I sat in the dim reading room, alone but not unwatched. The photograph lay before me on the polished table, and beside it a borrowed copy of Mallinson's diary from that same year. Not the kind kept for confessions, but for tracking time, tutorials, travel, trivialities. And on the page for April 12th, a line written more deeply than the rest. She knows more than she was meant to, and I less. No name, no context. But the timing aligned with Annalise's final term. It was the kind of line that isn't written for posterity, but for exorcism. Lewis, when I told him, asked whether the fall had ever been properly investigated. I said no. Or if it had, the investigation hadn't survived the college's need for continuity. He muttered something about cover-ups and closed doors. I said nothing. The truth in Oxford is rarely covered up. It is simply miscatalogued. It struck me then, not as theory but as tone, that the photograph was not commemorative. It was defensive. The placement of the three central figures, Mallinson, Wytham, and Vane Senior, was too deliberate, too symmetrical. And Annalise, half in shadow, wasn't supposed to be seen. But someone had seen her. Someone had kept the image. Arthur, perhaps, or Clara, or someone else entirely. I returned to the photograph before I left, traced her outline with my eyes. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't afraid either. There was something in the set of her shoulders, defiance, or maybe recognition. We forget too easily the women in these stories. We catalogue the men, the dons, the poets, the thinkers, and leave the women as footnotes or fragments. But Annalise had stood in that quad. She had witnessed something, perhaps more than one something. And now her name lay beneath a bequest that had been lost and a man who had died without explaining the second cup. Some truths die with the body, others wait, folded into images or caught in diary margins, and when they rise again, they do not explain, they observe, quietly, from just beyond the frame. I returned to Mallinson's rooms alone that afternoon. The porter had left the key in a brown envelope, folded in a way that suggested unease more than protocol. The door creaked, as all doors in Oxford do when memory lingers just past the threshold. It was the first time I'd entered without Lewis, and something about the solitude made the room feel smaller, more inclined to disclose itself. Bach was playing again. Or still. A recording I knew well. The C minor partita. Fifth movement, the kind of music that holds its grief just beneath precision. I stepped toward the radio, not to silence it, but to look. The volume dial was off. A fraction to the left. Barely perceptible, but enough. Mallinson had been fastidious, ritualistic. His music always played at precisely 25 past the hour, and never beyond the 6th notch. Today it sat between 7th and 8th. An unfamiliar hand's hesitation, not sabotage, just unfamiliarity. I turned it down, let the music die mid-line. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It pressed inward like breath withheld. I moved slowly, not searching exactly, but listening. The air felt slightly rearranged, like a room where someone has returned something to the wrong shelf. The bin was nearly empty, its liner unstuck at one edge. I lifted it gently and felt something roll unevenly beneath the creased newspaper at the bottom. A cup. Porcelain, faintly cracked, rim kissed by a trace of pale color. Not wine, not blood. Lipstick. unwashed, poorly hidden. I stared at it for a long moment before setting it on the windowsill. Lewis, when I told him, scoffed in the affectionate way he always did when he thought I was seeing ghosts in glassware. Perhaps Mallinson poured 2 cups and drank them both. Perhaps it was an old cup thrown away. Perhaps. But Lewis deals in presence. I deal in absence. And I knew what I knew. The sugar remained untouched, the spoon unstirred. The coffee made bitter, deliberately or distractedly. And now, this second cup, the one no one saw, because someone had ensured it would not be seen. I walked the perimeter of the room again. The chair's cushions were subtly misaligned, as if someone had sat without relaxing. The book on the table remained the Bacchae, still resting open near the lines of Euripides' ecstatic rites. In the end, wisdom comes through suffering, a classical comfort, I suppose. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of panic. The books remained as they had always been, loyal, composed, unreadable. And yet, I stood before the fireplace, the mantel empty but for the brass-framed photograph I'd first glimpsed in shadow. Annalise Corrin, though I hadn't yet heard her voice. Her image, caught at some unnoticed angle, seemed now to be watching everything else in the room. The music, the tray, the cooling cup no longer here. Mallinson had been, for all his flaws, incapable of forgetting. He had remembered her, in stone, in silence, in the deliberate decision to leave one seat across from him unoccupied, until it wasn't. I found myself imagining how it might have happened. Not a struggle, a conversation, perhaps, even a gentle one. Words long unsaid, laid out like artifacts, and then a moment, infinitesimal, when something turned. Not an argument, just a refusal. A truth too long buried, suddenly unearthed. The kind that unseats a life, and then the cup placed in the bin. Not as concealment, but as apology. Whoever had been here had known Mallinson once. Not academically, not formally. Known him in the way silence knows a room. This was not the work of an enemy. Enemies act in haste, with noise. This had been quiet, practiced, and final. I looked again at the cup on the windowsill. The light outside had begun to fade, and the lipstick, pale though it was, glimmered with a defiance that no one had noticed until now. Some poisons don't reside in chemicals or capsules. Some are brewed slowly over years, in withheld forgiveness, in postponed truth, in the bitterness that comes when love is remembered too late to be lived. And this one, this cup, had been poured in grief. I didn't yet know her name, but I knew she had once loved him, and I thought she had known how to end a conversation without raising her voice. It was Lewis who found the letter, quite by accident, which is to say, by one of those peculiar turns that feel accidental only in retrospect. He'd been looking for an incident report in the college's porter's lodge, and, finding the bin beside the shredder too neatly stacked, began to thumb through the refuse with that grudging diligence he affects when he'd rather not be proved wrong. He brought the fragments to me in an evidence bag, still faintly scented with the ink of bureaucratic remorse. I took them without a word and spread them carefully across my desk, realizing almost at once that this was no ordinary scrap. The handwriting, elegant, slanted, distinctly Mallinson's, had bled through the torn edges. Phrases leapt out before coherence had time to build itself. The Corrin matter, not Clara's error. The bequest, wrongly redirected. Her death. It wasn't quite a confession, but it was enough to feel like an invocation. A page never meant to be read, perhaps, or one meant for a particular pair of eyes, and no others. I sat with it longer than I meant to. Lewis waited in silence, drumming his fingers just softly enough not to seem impatient. The day had darkened while I read. Oxford skies have a talent for knowing when to close in, when to press their weight down onto spires and silence. Clara came to find me later. I don't know how she knew. Perhaps the college, like all colleges, still carries word through walls and whispers. She entered without knocking, her face unreadable, her coat carrying the scent of rain. She didn't ask whether I'd seen the letter. She simply said he was going to tell the world I was innocent. Her voice was not angry. It was quieter than that. Not a demand, a closing of something once long opened. He lied, she said. Not me. She sat down without waiting for permission, her gaze fixed not on me but on the corner of the room, as if Mallinson were still standing there, attempting once again to phrase the truth in a form palatable to history. She told me she had not come back for vengeance, not for public redress, not for publication, not even for exoneration. She had come to retrieve the truth, because the lie had lived too long, because silence, like mildew, grows thicker in closed rooms. I asked her, gently, whether she thought anyone else might have wanted that silence preserved. Her reply was quick. Anyone? Number, but someone. Perhaps. I looked again at the fragments of the letter, their edges like the borders of a confession too late to bind anything. Later, alone, I turned back to the crossword. The page had curled slightly at the corner from being handled too often. I ran a finger along the clue I'd marked but not yet solved. Where knowledge burns, silence falls. 9 letters. I'd circled it, underlined it, stared at it over half-finished meals and full cups of tea. And now, with the letters' phrases fresh in my mind, her death, wrongly redirected, truth withheld. The answer rose like breath in winter. Epiphany. Not just the word, the act. The kind of realization that arrives not with thunder, but with stillness. The understanding that what had seemed peripheral was in fact central. That Annalise's name was not an echo, but a foundation. That the woman in the background of the photograph had been standing at the very center of someone's life. That Mallinson had written to admit something, and someone had torn it before it could be spoken. I did not know who, not yet, but I knew this. Clara had told the truth, at least the part she came to tell, and Mallinson, in the end, had tried, which is more than most manage when the past begins to call its debts in full. I left the letter unfiled. Some truths are too delicate to archive. They live best in quiet recollection, when the house is still and the night holds its breath. Epiphany. 9 letters. And now, suddenly, complete. She confessed without saying the word. It wasn't in the phrasing, which remained spare and domestic, but in the cadence, a kind of tremor woven too neatly into sentences about tea bags and linens and the slow disintegration of a man's habits. Her name was Mrs. Ransom, though I had never thought of her by any name at all. She had been Mallinson's scout for 27 years. She had once pressed his shirts. She had once replaced his teaspoons. She had once, long before anyone noticed, poured a second cup of coffee and waited for someone not to arrive. I found her that evening folding napkins in the SCR pantry. Her hands were large and steady, not beautiful, but intimate with precision. When I asked whether she had been in the room before the porter, she did not answer. Instead, she placed the last napkin atop the pile and said, quite clearly, I was the one who knew where the bin was. There was no defensiveness in it, only clarity, the kind that comes after too long a silence. She had found the letters weeks ago, not all of them, just enough. The name Annalise had brought it back, and with it the unbearable proximity of consequence. The girl, not a rumor, not a mistake, not an unfortunate, but her niece, her sister's daughter. Brilliant, impulsive, too clever for caution. Mallinson had promised to support her scholarship. He had failed to deliver the funds, or had delivered them elsewhere. The difference, by then, hardly mattered. What remained was the fall, the questions no one had asked, the bequest that never reached its name. Mrs. Ransom had carried the knowledge the way some carry prayer, quietly, daily, not as consolation but penance. She had not intended to act. Until the night she overheard Mallinson speaking aloud in his rooms. Practicing, perhaps, a confession meant for someone else. But she had heard the name. Annalise. And something in her, old, faithful, unbearably worn, had shifted. She brought the coffee. She poured 2 cups. She sat opposite, though she did not drink. She let him speak, or try to, and when he faltered, she waited. But the apology never came. Not as she needed it, not as her niece deserved. He died, she said, not by her hand, but by the weight of his own undoing. It was the guilt, she believed, that finished him. She took the cup away before the police arrived, hid it in the bin, unwashed. She thought no one would notice, and perhaps no one would have if the room hadn't been so careful, if the silence hadn't rung so strangely on one side. I didn't arrest her. I simply told Lewis, when he asked, that she wouldn't need to be punished. Some crimes punish their keepers more thoroughly than the law ever could. And besides, I no longer believed it was a crime. It was a grief that had sat too long without a name. That night, I returned to the cafe. The rain had resumed, the same slow, polite rain that seems unique to Oxford, as if the clouds are apologizing for their persistence. I sat by the same window, the same seat. The cappuccino came, tepid and over-frothed, and I didn't touch it. The crossword lay finished. All but one square. Epiphany. 9 letters. The final clue. What survives the fire? I looked at it for a long time, and then I left it blank.